Welcome. Tactical approach to sys controls is actually what we're talking about today, but it's a defense in depth situation, so we're okay. I'm Jordan. I'm our Senior Manager of Service Delivery at Hawaiian Tel. I know a bunch of you from being around Hawaii for the last decade or so in managed services. But at HT, I'm responsible for our managed security, managed IT, and a bunch of other teams. My background, predominantly in managed services. I have a bunch of certifications. I get bored real easy, so I jump around. But that gives me kind of a interesting insight to stuff, maybe. I'm a talk story kind of guy, so throw out questions if you have them. There will be a Q&A at the end, but don't wait. Just if you have a question about something, you want to talk about something else, just throw it out there. So what are controls? When we talk about things in security, we're usually talking about technology, right? Like somebody's like, hey, I have a new tool you can install, a new firewall, a new whatever. And the idea is that that takes away the responsibility from us because it's supposed to be magic and fix all of our problems. I've never found one that actually did that. So when we start talking about real security, we start talking about what we refer to as controls, which are the things the technology is trying to actually accomplish. Controls are usually in three different categories. Physical are the most visible ones, right? Walls, doors, locks. These are physical controls. Their job is to keep things in or out. So if it's a bell or something, it's to let us know something's in or out, but the idea is it's a physical barrier to get to whatever the good thing is. We have technical and logical controls, and those are things we're really most familiar with, right? As engineers, I assume everybody in this room is an engineer or engineer adjacent. We're talking about firewalls, intrusion detection systems. We're talking about file permissions. We're talking about our day-to-day lives generally. And the group on the outside, they're dealing usually with the administrative controls, the policies, the procedures, and guidelines that sort of lead the behavior we expect out of people. So between these three things, this is really what security ends up being about for us. Today we're going to talk about some controls put together by the Center for Internet Security. They're a not-for-profit. They kind of work and establish guidelines for the rest of us to follow. The SIS 18 is a solid set of controls that we use as a baseline framework. It's very, very adjacent to all the compliance frameworks we usually use. HIPAA, obviously, PCI, CMMC for those in the DoD sector. But it's unique because it's agnostic. It's what we're supposed to do in every industry, in every vertical, and it's scalable. So I like starting from there. And why the SIS 18? Why waste time saying lots controls when few controls do trick, right? 2 years ago it was the SIS 20. Two of them weren't making a huge difference, so now we have the SIS 18. That's one of the upsides of the set. All right. So SIS 18 kind of looks like this. It's a general set of categories, and it's fairly concise. I don't really like, if you ever looked at the Excel sheets for things like PCI, they're miles long, hundreds of columns wide. SIS is pretty straightforward. There's 18 control categories. Each one has some sub-controls, and they do a good job of kind of breaking it down and telling you what you and your kind of business should do. They understand that not every business needs every one of these controls, right? Security is about right-sizing solutions to protect the value of the assets you have. A 10-person company usually doesn't have the same asset value as a 100,000-person company. So when we talk about controls, we're talking about aligning the need of the business with their asset value and implementing things that make sense for that kind of group. Each of the categories is then broken into a type of control. So what is the goal of it? Are we trying to identify things, protect things, detect things? Are we responding to threats? Are we recovering from threats? So if you look at the SIS controls list, and I think there's a handout in the back that has a few of them, and it has the URL for the full complete list on it. So grab that on your way out if you haven't already. It'll show you what the objective of this control is. And that helps you kind of focus and really hone in on what you're trying to accomplish. Because sometimes when we're giving guidelines, if you've been through an audit, you're like, what are they trying to accomplish here, right? Like, I know what the auditor wants me to say. They want me to say I log everything and I read it every day, and I don't. So it's really getting the real value out of something. And then they're super cool, and they break it down into these implementation groups. And these are where all of us are going to get real value. Implementation groups are here to help you understand which your business needs to follow. There's a total of 153 controls in SIS 18. A small business doesn't need to do all 153 things. If you did, you'd be bogged down all day. You probably wouldn't have time to do your actual business. So the idea is that there's IG 1 through 3. IG1 is really about the essentials. When we talk about cyber hygiene, we're talking about the basics, right? What does everybody need to do every day to be relatively secure? What do we need to do to stop the average attack, the phishing attempts we see every day, the random drive-bys, hey, you forgot to update your QNAP and they scanned the internet and they saw you out there. The basics. As you grow, you got to get a little bit better. IG2 is that next step. It's for the medium to large businesses, the maybe not fully targeted attacks, but generally more sophisticated things. Maybe some spear phishing, maybe stuff pointed at your vertical. Maybe this is where you start seeing more HIPAA stuff lying in, or if you're a big credit card processor, you're seeing more of the high-level PCI stuff. And then you get to the big boys, right? The IG3s, and these are you are being targeted. There's advanced persistent threats out there that are looking for companies just like yours. They're hoping to knock on your door and steal all of your data specifically. They're not looking for any data. They're not looking to just encrypt anyone. They want you. And the IG3s of the world need that kind of protection. So as you see, as you grow, you have to do more stuff. You need more people. You need more tools. And that's what makes this a really scalable framework. Any questions about any of that so far? I kind of want to give you the high level look for those who weren't really familiar with it just yet.
Is it called SIS-18 because it came out in 2018?
No, it's SIS-18 because they just came up with 18 categories. It was SIS-20 when they had 20 controls, and then they realized that they weren't all super unique or useful. They're very practical people, my kind of people. But good question. So let's dive into some of the goal of this presentation today wasn't to just kind of bore you about explaining who SIS is. I wanted to dive into some particular controls and kind of give you examples of what you're looking to see here. When you go to the website or you grab the handout, this is the kind of layout you'll see. They'll talk about the group of controls it is. This is control group 2, asset inventory. And one of the cool things is you'll see here, there's 7 total safeguards. If you're an IG1, you only need to do 3 of the 7. And they'll identify what 3 those are. And those are the most important 3 for a business your size. As you get larger, you have to do 3 more. And when you're really worried about being attacked, when you're targeted, when your asset value is so high that you can start focusing on new enterprise tools, specialty security teams working with vendors to make sure that kind of stuff is taken care of, they have one more thing you need to probably do from an asset perspective. When we talk about asset inventory, most of us immediately go to physical, right? Like everybody here probably has a spreadsheet or a tool that's telling you how many desktops you have, how many servers. Does anybody not have something like that in place? All right, everybody does. I'll pretend I did too. No, but it's more than that. And we found this out kind of the hard way last year, right? Does anybody remember the Log4j compromise and vulnerabilities going around last year? This came right to the forefront because everybody's like, wait, are we vulnerable? And the companies who didn't have a good software inventory were kind of in the dark and terrified because not only did they know there was something really spooky and bad out there, they had no idea if they were vulnerable to it. And that's terrifying. Like, it's one thing to know you're vulnerable because you can try to put up some controls, you can turn off the server, you can patch it, you can do whatever you need to do. But when you're in the dark, it's awful. And a lot of times we don't even have the foresight to see what's in the software we're using. We just bought it a couple of years ago because somebody said they needed it. Somebody over in accounting wanted this cool thing, so we installed it. Having a good digital asset inventory is the start to a lot of this stuff. So control, let's see what it is, 2.2. You can see it's for IG groups 1, 2, and 3. So this is something everyone should be doing. It's specifically about software inventory. And not only knowing what inventory exists, but knowing if it's under support or not. And if it's not under support, understanding what controls you have in place to protect you for when they have a problem. How many of you go this in depth with your inventories? Not a lot of hands. It's a lot of work, but this is where it really starts to help, right? And this is considered fundamental security hygiene. You know what you have, it's protected so you can get updates, and you know when it's not so you can build in and control around it. And that's what we talk about when we start talking about controls. Any questions about that? All right. So the next set of controls kind of came about because we started trusting a lot of vendors a lot. And 2020 and 2021 were a scary year to trust vendors. Late 2020, we found out that SolarWinds, one of the most trusted people in the enterprise space, had been compromised the year before by a nation state. That was unheard of at the time. Like, No one believed we needed to double check if Orion was safe. Thousands and thousands of businesses have trusted these tools for years, and they got compromised as a result. And I'm not saying any level of control would have stopped that. I'd have a hard time saying anybody who got caught in that did something wrong, because they were the ultimate example of someone you trust. Microsoft was compromised because of this, right? Like, multiple government agencies compromised because of these kinds of attacks. So that one, maybe you get a pass. Then Kaseya hits. And for anybody who's in the managed service space, Kaseya is one of the biggest vendors for remote or management platforms out there. They do everything from password management, so you can store your passwords with them, to full remote access scripting, automation. They do antivirus, they do EDR protection, they do everything an MSP needs to deliver services to businesses like yours. And somebody breached them, then used that tool set to deploy ransomware. And that is scary, because again, you're ultimately trusting access to your networks to somebody that you think is doing their jobs. And not a lot of companies go that extra step to understand what security those companies are implementing. And that's what this kind of security control is about. When we look at Control 15, we're talking about service provider management. This is making sure that the people you're working with are doing their part to keep you secure. You can't just blindly trust these anymore, because the outcome is horrific. If we go back to Kaseya, there were thousands of businesses who woke up one morning on a Monday and were encrypted. And the attackers were bold. They said, hey, Kaseya, you give us $50 million, we decrypt everyone, or they can each pay us whatever we say. That's an aggressive attack, and it's very pointed. They weren't hiding how they did it. They were coming at the vendor this time and using every other network to hold the vendor hostage. And the vendor didn't pay, right? They're not there to have your back when that kind of stuff happens. They're there to maybe advise you, but it's up to you to make sure that you're safe. So back to Control 15. This one is a good example of, we don't expect the small shops to do this, right? We don't expect the 10, 20 person companies, their convenience stores, the bakeries, the little guys to do this kind of stuff, because this is a lot of work. But when you're that IG3, you need to make sure you're asking for things like SOC audits. You need to make sure you're asking about when the business you're about to trust with all your data had their last compromise. When was their last audit? When did they last check on this stuff? And what do they do to make sure they are protected so you don't get caught up in their wake? And these are the kinds of controls you need to start thinking about. Any good vendor should be able to provide you that. Give you a certificate that says, hey, we got audited at this point in time. Since that audit, here are the things that have changed, if any. Here are the things we've improved. Here's what the audit said we did bad at. And they should be able to answer for that kind of stuff. We have to. Every year we get asked these questions because we have a data center. And no one's going to put stuff in our data center if we're just like, no, just trust us. We got this. Like, there's locks or something. That's not good enough. We can't expect people to believe that we're doing everything without proving it. And these kinds of controls are how you can ask your vendors to prove this stuff. It's how you hold them accountable. Do any of you work with your vendors to get these kinds of audit certificates, or check in with them to see what their controls are? I see some yeses. I know you guys do. And it's a hard thing to ask, right? Like, in most businesses, getting approval to use software is hard enough. You get the budget people saying yes or no. You get all kinds of like advice on what you should and shouldn't do. Everybody wants a say. Everybody has a different need. To then go down the route of, well, the vendor I really like that has this really cool tool doesn't actually guarantee they have malware protection on their network. They aren't guaranteeing uptime. They aren't guaranteeing disaster recovery. For organizations like us, we have a lot of critical infrastructure responsibility. So the Department of Justice gets a say in who we get to use. So if I go out to a vendor, I have to be able to say, as to the extent of, are there non-US citizens with access to our data? And that's a big red flag for our organization, because we want to make sure that everybody we do business with is protected. And you don't have to go to that extent usually, but depending on the business, you might. So understanding what level of protection you need and how much you're willing to trust your vendors becomes critical as you grow and kind of scale. All right. And then we move into things that I think people are a little more comfortable with maybe. Incident response, management, that type of thing. How many of you have an IR team or have some role in the incident response kind of framework in your organization? When bad stuff happens, how many of your cell phones ring? Right? That's really what this is talking about is, hey, something bad happened. All the other controls we had didn't work. Somebody's cell phone is going to ring, and they're going to be responsible for that. Here, according to CIS, there's 9 safeguards you need to have in place. If you're an IG1, there's 3. If you're an IG2, there's 8. If there's an IG3, you get an extra one. Our IG 1s, 2s, and 3s, it's simple. Dedicate someone to make sure they're responsible for that action. It shouldn't be a question of who you call when the bad thing is happening. That's too late to answer that question. Have any of you been unlucky enough to be part of a ransomware situation in your workplace or worked with someone who was? Minutes matter, right? Like when you're sitting there, you see things are encrypted. It's not, who do I call? Like, can't get to my files. Do I just reboot? Do I call the help desk? That is not the time to start learning how to handle an incident like that. You need a plan. So their advice, 17.1, the first thing they tell you for incident response is just pick someone. Make them in charge, list their information, make sure everybody knows it, and when the bad thing happens, call that person. So everybody is on the same page from the get-go. You don't want to try to wrangle 15 people who are all responding differently. You don't want one help desk guy rebooting a server because they don't know what's going on while the other starts restoring a backup. It's chaos. You cause way more problems. So rule 1, pick someone, pick 2 people, get them looped in, make them run the show. As you get bigger, you have to actually test those things. How many of you test your incident response plan? How many of you have written and documented incident response plans? More hands than I thought. That's good. How many of you have tested it in the last year? Fewer hands, but good. A lot of people don't test this stuff. They write it down, it's in a binder, throw the binder on a shelf. We're all working from home now. Everybody doesn't know where the binder is. That happens every day. It's like, oh yeah, it was documented in the thing in the office. No one's there. So when the bad thing happens, it's like, we got to go get that binder, I guess, step 1. But it's about testing these things and practicing to make sure they work. And this doesn't just go for incident response. This goes for all of our planning, right? When we're doing this stuff, it's about making sure that the thing works the way we think it does. I write down things on paper all the time, right? And it doesn't always go the way I expect when we try it. I think it's Mike Tyson. He said, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. Ransomware is that punch in the face. If you wake up in the morning and you can't get to your files, your plans are rough. They're going to get tested. So test them ahead of time. Let's see. All right. So that's kind of a course on some of the controls that are in place there. How many of you are doing most of those? And that's 4 of 153. So good, lots. How many of you will go back today and maybe check and see if you're doing those things? Good. That's the right answer, is maybe go figure out if these are being done. The cool part about SIS as a whole, and what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about, is as you work through this framework, you're going to be given kind of tasks, right? We look at stuff and we're like, plan and conduct routine incident response exercises, blah, 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 right? Like, it tells you to go do something. But one of the big problems that we run into is often we don't know the best way to do that stuff in our environments. Technology changes every day. We're bombarded with vendors every day, like Hawaiian Telcom that call you. And we say, hey, we have a new thing. It'll fix all your problems. Just install it. That's not really helpful when we talk about real security. It helps in some areas. It fixes some gaps. But one of the things SIS offers is what they call their benchmarks. So if you start diving into this framework on your own or with us or with another vendor, ask about this stuff, because what SIS does is they go out and they look at each common technology and they say, here's the best way to secure these to meet the objectives we just asked you to meet. So as an example, in something like Server 2019, I went and grabbed their password policy. This is familiar to everybody, right? Basic stuff, 24 or more passwords history. That means you can't repeat the same thing. I get tired typing in that exclamation point at the end 24 times, so I just come up with a new one. Yeah, see, you guys all do that, I know. But also ensuring maximum password age is still there. This one, people go back and forth on. It's still the SIS recommendation to do it. I can take it either way, as long as there's multi-factor auth or something in there. Minimum password age, so you can't just change it 24 times in a row. That way you have to, add it each day. Minimum character lengths. These used to be 8. 14 is the recommendation now, because computers are too fast. If it's 8 passwords, they're going to jam through that real quick. I see people's eyes kind of looking at each other. Yeah, 8 character passwords, Stella. Don't worry. But that's why some of these other things come into play, right? You want to make sure complexity requirements are turned on. How many of you have all these things on your network? How many of you get complaints from your users that they have to do all these things on their network? That's the real question. That's how you know if somebody has it turned on, because if they don't get complaints, they don't have it turned on. And you want to make sure they're being stored without using reversible encryption, right? doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to store things in a way that you can decrypt and then have somebody's password. So when we start talking about benchmarks, this is the kind of information you can get from the syscontrols programs. So Sys has this information available. Tons of it is free. They do the alignments with popular compliance frameworks, HIPAA, PCI, all that stuff. And then in addition to that, they even have hardened images of stuff. So if you go out and you need a hardened Unix image, a Linux image, a Windows image, they pre-harden this stuff. You can drop it on, license it. Like, it's a very valuable set of data to start working through. And then if you're working with vendors like us who partner with them, they have some tools to help audit your network and do all that kind of stuff. So it's very worthwhile. You get a certificate today. But that was kind of it. I wanted to sort of jam through this and leave some questions open because I like asking questions instead of looking at slides. So any questions about any of this? Any controls or thoughts that you want to talk about? Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about the 18 controls. So if you had the choice between, let's say, top 5 you should work on, first, which of the 5 would you recommend?
Which of the 5 would I recommend? Yeah.
Maybe it's too hard of a question.
It's always an it depends, right? So the question was, which 5 of these make the most sense? I'd say it depends on the size of your business, and I'd say that they have the order you should go in. So we would usually aim for the essential stuff first, so all the IG1 items first. I always like to start with inventory control. So if we look at this, you guys can't see it, but if you have the handout, you'll see some of these have 0 IG1 areas, right? A good example is pen testing. We have tons of people who come and they're like, hey, we want to get pen tested. It's like, cool, where's your asset inventory? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, what are we pen testing? Right? Like, it doesn't make sense to do a pen test unless you've knocked out inventory. So I'm a very strong advocate of starting with an inventory because if you don't know what you have, you can't protect it. You just can't. And especially now, like, the work from home thing caused a lot of problems technically, but one of the biggest lasting effects is our data is everywhere again, right? Like, it went from, okay, things are kind of under control, they're in the offices, like I know where all my desktops are, we finally got some standardization, to just kidding, go home, throw everything on OneDrive. Like, it got kind of wild. So inventory now more than ever is super important. Where are people storing stuff? Is everybody storing it where you think it's being stored? We're a large company. Each department is kind of making up their own way as they go because we can't keep up with the requests, right? Our IT department is hammered setting up VPNs. They're not worried about if you're using Box or OneDrive. So then our security team, Mike's not in here, but his whole job was looping those guys back in and saying, hey, I know you really like Box and you really like Dropbox, but we're a OneDrive shop, so I need you to start bringing this stuff back in-house and putting it here. We need to protect it. We need to make sure if it's shared, we know who it's shared with and build those processes. So inventory was critical. And for a large organization, that'll take a year because people change all the time. They get frustrated with one of these controls and they're like, I want to send a giant email. Never mind your rules. Dropbox. See, they know. I can tell who works in this stuff because they deal with all these things every day. And then you move on to stuff like data protection, and that's going to be things like anti-malware, your basics, your patching, doing that type of activity. Password policies are very high on my list, and if you don't have multi-factor authentication, I'll tell you that's probably what you need to do next. Because realistically, if you knock out like those 4 or 5 things, 85% of your problems are kind of addressed. Like if you have MFA, you're kind of good on a lot of things. If you have patching, you have endpoint security, you have inventory, you're okay because if something bad happens, hopefully your EDR pops off and you get an alarm, and then you're like, okay, this happened. I know what all my other assets that talks to are. You can start investigating and you kind of start scoping your problem out. Without an inventory, it's, okay, that desktop's broken. Where is that one? Is that a home user or is that in the office? And you're at home, so you don't know. You have to kind of go figure it out then. So inventory is very much on that list. But good question. And then you kind of work your way through it. Yeah. So the question was, who evaluates what IG level you are? You do. And it's really loose, right? The idea is you look at your environment and you say, what am I trying to protect? And you be honest about that. I'd like to think every idea I had is worth $1 billion. They probably aren't in real life. So if you're a $10,000 a year business or a $100,000 a year business, you really have to try to assess what value are you trying to protect? And then your budget to defend that stuff is based on what you're trying to protect and the likelihood of a problem. So if you're, a $100 million a year company, But realistically, if something really bad were to happen, you'd lose $1 million. And the likelihood of that happening is only 10% a year. You spend $100,000 a year protecting it, because if you spend $200,000, you're outspending the risk. So you look at that, and that kind of helps you understand these IG levels. Are you a big company that you're in the news, people are targeting you, you're worth breaking into specifically, or is the risk really somebody's going to open an email, you weren't really getting targeted, hopefully they catch it, and you adjust to that. So it's up to you to kind of pick. But realistically, when you knock out all the IG1 stuff, you just start working into IG2, and then your budget will kind of dictate the rest.
Don't let your auditors decide that.
Yeah, they're going to say IG3 all day.
So you know that the first speaker was telling us about that bill that was passed.
Yep.
Getting audited. Do they follow this guideline? Or?
So the one that he was talking about specifically, there were two. There was CMMC. CMMC follows NIST 800. NIST 800 is managed by the US government. This is managed by a not-for-profit. There's very tight alignment. I'd say it's not exact, because CMMC has 3 tiers, kind of like this. They started with 5 and they're kind of in flux, but there's like 80% overlap when you start looking at all the different compliance frameworks. Like if you look at PCI versus HIPAA versus CMMC, 85% of the stuff is the same, and then like the last 15 is specific to the industry. So they follow in line. The second one was SB 1100. That was specific to insurance providers. And that's very much in line with this stuff. It's making sure that if they're providing insurance providers have a lot of data, is I think what the driving factor there was. There were already some national laws, but they have a ton of information about businesses and people. So they passed a law to ensure that anyone giving out insurance had very stringent reporting policies and also controls in place. So it's not a complete matchup, but you'd be hard pressed to find something in here that doesn't show up in one of those compliance frameworks. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hey Jordan, so I'm a little late. I don't know if you covered it already. What about people who are using mobile devices and accessing Office 365? Is there any security issues where maybe key lock trackers are monitoring and able to get access into that mobile device?
Yeah, the question was, so are there risks with using mobile devices, specifically around like key loggers and things like that? Always yes, but they're treated holistically when we talk about controls, right? A mobile device is just an extension of everything else we do at this point. Like to say a mobile device is different than your desktop is almost entirely false, right? I mean, my phone, I do 80% of my job from my phone, I think, some days. So yes, it's definitely a risk. The upside of that is a lot of those ecosystems are very tightly controlled, more so than desktop environments, right? To download an app on an Android phone, you have to intentionally go and say, I want to be able to download from an untrusted place, and then you kind of put yourself at risk. The Play Store does a pretty good job of keeping some stuff out, with a few exceptions. There's been a few notable exceptions, but most of the time you have a little bit of control there. Apple does a really good job as well. But there are always still going to be risks. It's an operating system running on a device that interfaces with your network. And it's not just email, right? Like OneDrive syncs to phones now, and you have to make those decisions. There's actually a set of controls and benchmarks for mobile devices on here.
And you could require MDM too.
Yep. MDM is there. I mean, you can see Microsoft takes that stuff really seriously, because Intune is included with most levels of licensing. So it took a while for people to just kind of pull the trigger and admit that they were going to have mobile devices in their environments, right? It used to be you can do it, but whatever, it's not a problem. Call Verizon if it's broken. Those days are kind of gone, especially with work from home. Everybody's on their phones all the time. We're always in different places. So it's sort of the IT department's problem now. So yeah, MDM solutions like that, definitely usable. Forcing logon durations, understanding that when you're offboarding people, you have to go kill tokens and things like that as part of the offboarding process, not just disable an account. You have to build a lot of that stuff into your kind of your structure. What else?
What are your thoughts on the password managers that generate random passwords and store them for users?
I like them. I think that if we're in a day and age where we honestly expect people to have passwords for everything and not reuse them, you don't have a really another choice. I prefer offline ones, but I understand the need for online ones. So far, I don't think we've had a significant breach of an online password provider that had any type of impact to actual users. We've seen, I think, 1Password had an issue recently, but it was LastPass, was it, that had an issue with their source code being leaked. So we'll see where that leads. That's not ideal, but they don't have access to your primary encryption key, so you're okay. But I don't think there's a better option in the world. Like, it's either they use the same password, they reset their password every time, or they use a password management tool, especially if we want long passwords and we want unique passwords and complex passwords. So I'm a big advocate of, passphrases and teaching that methodology. But at the end of the day, if you have a tool that you're logging into once a month, you're just not going to remember it all the time. So it's sort of a necessary evil. I'm looking forward to like passwordless future state. I think that'll be cool. I think tools like Slack are doing a really good job where they send magic links and it logs in through that kind of stuff. I'm hoping that gets embraced. I'm also a big fan of less stringent password, but with multi-factor. I think that's like a solid answer to a lot of those problems. So somewhere in the next couple of years, we'll probably see some settlement in that area. I mean, I think a lot of companies are still on the old NIST standard, which was change your password every 90 days and also make it super long and complex and be unique. And that's pretty brutal for anyone. I mean, when I was 20, I was like, this is easy. What's with all these old people? Now I'm like, I have too many passwords. I can't remember anything. I smash that reset password link all the time. So I've learned my lesson on that side of it. But good question. What else? Yeah.
Speaking of software and vendors, for example, like what would be your approval process or what would be your recommended steps to approve somebody for software or even vendors?
Sure. So what we normally go through is we establish a need, right? It's what are we actually trying to solve here? If you work in a small business that's owned and you know the owners of the company and they go to conferences, I've worked in a lot of those spaces with being a managed service provider. We had a shiny thing syndrome is what we called it, where they would go out, they would hit a vendor who bought them a steak dinner, and they would come back and it's like, boom, new security tool. I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, what are we trying to actually solve here? So step one is what's the problem? Step two is go do some research that didn't buy you a steak dinner and check out what products are available. And then kind of hone it down to one or two and demo them. See what it looks like in your environment, do some due diligence, who uses them, can you talk to references? References are kind of sketchy because if a company can't come up with two people to vouch for them, they're probably not on your radar. Anybody can find someone to say you're good. But ask the questions, go through what does that process look like, call into their support line, make sure they answer the phone. From my experience, the sales process is going to be the best experience you ever have with a vendor generally. So if that's not super smooth, there's probably going to lead to some rough roads because they're on their best behavior in that initial sales call, right? So go through that process, evaluate them, see who their customer base kind of looks like. I tend to do some research and see if there's any CVEs out there about their products and things like that. I'd ask about breaches. What big problems have you had? Is there a roadmap for security? And ask those kinds of questions. And if they're a big enough vendor, start asking about things like SOC compliance. When was the last time you got audited? Where do you store your data? Ask those types of questions. And then do a good legal review. That's one of the things I learned when I moved to Hawaiian Tel a few years ago was our legal teams are crazy complicated. Like they argue over mundane stuff like where do you sue each other if this goes wrong? Turns out that's super important. So have your legal team look over the contract, make sure they understand the implications of that deal, make sure that you're protected if it goes wrong, see where the damages are, things like that. But definitely start with, do I actually need this and what problem am I trying to solve? And do I already have a tool that solves that kind of? Because what you don't want to end up in is a situation where you have 50 tools to manage and you can't keep up with it because tools are only as good as their management. So 10 really well managed tools are way better than 20 poorly managed tools. So you got to kind of drive and make sure you're only solving for real problems and that you're solving for them in a way that's sustainable for your team.
You should also check out their financials
Yep.
because you don't want to go with a vendor that's going to go bankrupt.
Yeah.
Especially nowadays with the stock market.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. What you're saying is ask about their financial status. How long have they been around? If they popped up last year and hit the market and you see all these crazy cool websites and they're at every conference all of a sudden, be skeptical. Like there's a lot of comfort in longevity, knowing they'll be there next year, the year after. Like I'm not a huge fan of cutting edge technology. I like dull, boring technology that's proven and has worked really well. Like cutting edge is for people who want to bleed. That's not me. So pick tools that are proven. Even if, and usually the people who say they found like that knew they found it. They're like, this is it. This is the epitome of security. They're almost always wrong. Like I just don't trust that kind of marketing. So I look for trusted, true, good reputation, some good referrals, and legal standing to for us to take action if we need to. What else?
I have a question. So in the nonprofit sector, sometimes you have software mandated by a funder.
Yep.
And so you have staff who are putting data into a piece of software that you have no control over. So what kind of risk mitigation and controls would you recommend in those situations?
One is understand how valuable is that funder. That's going to drive a lot of that conversation, right? But two, understand what the data is and what the minimum and what the use of that data really is. If they're requiring general statistical data because they want to do some type of an analysis on the community you're serving, I'm guessing is what they're after. They want to make sure that their money is going to the area they think it is. Usually that can be either anonymized or in some way turned less sensitive. If it's actual treatment information and things like that, there's a couple of major vendors out there that do that type of stuff where they collect the treatment information and then they do broad community analysis. They've been around for a while, work with vendors that, and make sure you're working with a vendor that actually has a background in it. And train your staff. Minimum data entry for what's required. Don't put too much stuff if you don't need to. That goes for audits also, by the way. Teach your staff to give minimum information so you don't cause more problems for yourself typically. But that's kind of the idea, is there's not a lot you can do if it's somebody who kind of holds the purse strings, right? Like they have a requirement, figure out the why behind it, see how you can achieve it, make sure people understand what's actually required, and then just do that. And keep the rest in like the EHRU control.
Okay. Yeah, because there's some vendors who, they come back and say, we need you to open these 20,000 ports and use IE compatibility mode with a Silverlight application. And you're like,
Yeah, this was cool 10 years ago, but that's hard. So we've dealt with that. Yeah, it's even outside of your area. I mean, I used to work with a food distribution company, and the question was, just for the recording, is what happens if their requirements are kind of dated? Large organizations move slowly. If they're big enough, they don't have to change for anybody, so they can just pass down those requirements and you have to deal with it. There's ways to isolate yourself from that risk. So if the need is you have to do that stuff, start looking at dedicated computers to enter the data from, extra controls on those machines. So it's, maybe it's set up a terminal server, a VDI that's just dealing with that stuff. Or, I mean, I've seen down to the point where, each person, the people who have to deal with that data have a separate computer that they just KVM over to. And it's like, okay, it's an older machine. It's, it's isolated from the network. We know it's going to be sort of at risk. Throw something like deep freeze on it, so if something does happen, you reboot it, it's good to go. You have to start looking at that kind of control. If you just need broad access to that stuff, it gets a lot harder. But often when I've seen those types of requirements, there's usually a handful of people in the company who actually need it, and you can build some kind of enclave solution to keep them away. Yep. Yeah.
I have two questions. So I know you talked about the inventory, but how about now we lots of people there, us, we have a lot of things that on SaaS. So does it fall under any of the enterprise assets or the software assets for inventory control, or how do you get inventory control for the SaaS services? The second question is we kind of work from home, and as a system administrator, then we always access it at home, and our account, let's say the global admin. But because we don't get together, our team, so a lot of times, because before in the office, we will get together and then go into look into one thing together. But now it's separate. So then we get a sub-situation. Another system administrator, I need access. Another one, I need access too. And I need access. So they become 5 global admins, right? 6 enterprise admin, 7 domain admin sort of thing for that SaaS service. So do you have any recommendation on the security side that how should we still limit to maybe only 1 or 2 admin for that?
So 2 questions, right? Is 1, how do you handle inventory of SaaS solutions? And 2, how do you ensure minimum access, right? Least privilege is kind of what we're talking about for those solutions. So inventory is fairly straightforward. SaaS is easy because you get a bill for it. So that's one of the upsides of using software as a service from an inventory perspective is your accounting department knows who you're using. So use that as kind of a guideline, like validate what you're using, what the tools are, and check with your accounts payable team. Like they know who they're paying bills to. Make sure you didn't forget about anything, that services didn't get turned down, that these things aren't out there. But treat it the same way. What are you using? What is the use for it? What parts of the tool are you actually using? Because that's a big one when we start diving into like Office 365, right? Like we buy E3 licenses, we use 5 of the 47 applications available or something, but understand that the rest are still risks. Turn them off from a policy perspective if you don't need them. That was a big thing in Google Workspace also. If you don't want them using that calendar, turn off the features if you can, depending on the SaaS solution. From a security perspective, I always go back to people should not be using their administrator accounts as their default accounts, first of all. So you should have an account for day-to-day activity, and then you should have an administrator account that you log into when you want to do something. So that's the first step towards that typically. That way you don't have that accidental enterprise admin logging into their workstation just to browse the internet and catch Netflix and, watch House of Dragons during downtime. Like, yeah, right when it comes out. But that's kind of the idea, and keep track of it. Document who's an admin, why they're an admin, and have a control process for turn up and turn down of that stuff. So ours, if you want an access request, you have to submit an access request through our ticketing system. You have to designate the software you need. We have a designated software owner. So you say, I need access to this, and I need this level of access for this reason. The software owner reviews it, approves it, it gets sent back to our sysadmin team, and they can execute that change. So there's heavy change management around administrative access to all of our tools for that exact reason. You really need to justify it. If it's short term because you need to troubleshoot a problem, turn it on, turn it back off if that's really what you need. But really look into separation of those accounts. Have day-to-day accounts, have enterprise admin accounts. Make it very clear which ones are admins, so when they pop up in a SIM log somewhere, you can be like, that's weird. It makes it easy for your SOC or whatever your security team is, your help desk, to identify that something strange is going on with an admin account versus your regular account. And that helps. So it doesn't fix the problem. You still have a lot of accounts because people need a lot more access now, but it gives you more visibility into it and more control over it. And lower activity is easier to track. So if they're not using it every day, when something does happen, it's probably an anomaly. You're like, that's weird. They shouldn't be using that maybe. And same thing for service accounts, right? If they're running on local servers, make sure your service accounts are labeled properly and that they're running with minimum privilege and things like that as well. Because that's the other one that a lot of people, you slap in the software to demo, you throw in your admin account, and then you forget about it because it just goes live. You got to clean that kind of stuff up and make sure that you're using proper service accounts with right set and things like that. All right, I think we're almost out of time. Any last questions?
How many of those 18 items have you implemented or gone through?
I don't do this full-time for Hawaiian Tel. I actually take care of our customers, but we go through the full thing. It's part of our audit. We do SOC audits as well, so we actually have third parties come in to audit us, so we don't get the pass just because we're the security team. We have a third party that comes in and audits us.
Yourself and ID3?
Yeah. We're definitely at that level. And it's because, we're considered critical infrastructure for the state. We're mandated to have a level of oversight that most people don't. We're an ISP. We're a service provider to many businesses. We own a data center. IG3 would be the correct category. But yeah, well, thank you all. Appreciate your time. Hopefully it was worthwhile, and thanks for coming again today.